I seek agreement agenda item 5 is recorded by Hansard. Apologies received from Michaela Boyle. Any other apologies?
Just John McAllister and Judith Cochran could be slightly late, Chair.
Okay. Can I inform members that Mr Jim Wells has joined the committee to replace Peter Weir? Can I welcome Jim to his first meeting of the Finance and Personnel Committee? Can I also seek agreement from committee to write to Peter Weir? I think Peter's been on this committee for a considerable period of time and has made a very valued and informed contribution to the committee. So can I seek agreement that we write a letter to Peter wishing him well in his new role as Education Chair?
Great.
Can I remind members that declarations of interest for a new member can be found on the Assembly website. Moving on to draft minutes, pages 5 to 8, members can turn their accurate records. Agreed. Summary table requests, pages 10 to 11 of the packs for noting. Can I remind members that last week's meeting the committee agreed to postpone the roundtable event until a more opportune time. Members queried whether the Big Four local banks have agreed the new bank branch closure protocol which has been developed in Britain. The Consumer Council has since clarified that whilst the initial discussions were with the London-based groups, the FCA is arranging through the British Bankers Association to hold meetings with the Big Four banks in this regard, and the Consumer Council will monitor the situation and inform the committee of any developments in relation to this. Moving on to our first item of business, the reading of online business, briefing from Assembly Research. This is pages 13 to 29 of your packs. And can I welcome Michael Scholes to the meeting? Michael, I'll just give you an opportunity to present the paper and then we'll go to questions from members.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just give a brief outline of the paper and then be free to take questions at the end. So the paper is really structured in the following ways. Section 1 really looks at definitions and some background information. Section 2 really looks at the challenges for Northern Ireland policymakers when trying to rate online businesses. Section 3 really looks at how other jurisdictions are trying to legislate or ideas that they're bringing forward in this area, including the US, the UK and Canada. And then Section 4 concludes the paper. So really, in terms of the paper, online retailers are defined as any company or individual who conducts online retail transactions. And the bricks and mortar retailers really just refers to your high street traditional retailer. So online retail transactions then describe retail activity that is conducted online with or without ownership or occupation of commercial premises. So over the last few years, there's been a rapid rise in online retailing, and many bricks and mortar retailers see this as a threat to their existing businesses. They also view the rate system as providing certain commercial advantages for the online retailer. For example, the online retailer is not tied physically to the marketplace and can choose any distribution centre or warehouse in any area with low non-domestic rates. Also, they can use any distribution techniques, modern distribution techniques, to reduce the amount of storage that they need, and therefore smaller warehouses tend to also lower the amount of non-domestic rates that they'll pay. There's also a perception amongst bricks and mortar retailers that the online retailer really can avoid paying non-domestic rates altogether, or certainly reduce their bills through working at home. Now, if I could just draw your attention to the tables on page 7 and 8 of the paper, this really outlines how EPS deal with this kind of mixed use of commercial and domestic use in properties. Generally speaking, if there is a mixture of commercial and domestic use, LPS do not value the commercial use unless the building or extensions, say for example, is used exclusively for commercial purposes. Now, they do stress as well that each case is viewed individually, but in general that seems to be the rule. So we'll move on now to section 3 of the paper. Currently the UK is undertaking a review of non-domestic rates, or business rates as it's called in England, Scotland and Wales. As part of that review, the Business Innovation and Skills Select Committee recommended the introduction of an online sales tax. Now, the UK government has rejected this really for a number of reasons, mainly because they see it as double taxation. Online retail transactions are already subject to VAT, so any additional taxation they would view as double taxation. Also, it could be administratively quite expensive to introduce an online sales tax. And also, really, they would see it as, it's been mooted that it could be a block or a hinder for entrepreneurship, which could limit future economic growth. Now, sales taxes already exist in the US and Canada for bricks and mortar retailers. So, in the US, sales taxes are collected on retail sales at the time of the transaction. So the seller collects the tax and pays it to the state authorities. And that's at the moment only for bricks and mortar transactions. However, there's legislation going through at the moment in the US, the Marketplace Fairness Bill, if enacted, would grant states the power to compel online retailers to collect taxes from their online transactions and then remit it to the state in which the customer exists. So if you were selling to someone in Texas, then you have to collect the online retail tax at the Texas rate, and then the retailer itself, if it was even outside the state of Texas, would then pay the Texas authority that portion of the sale. Now, online retailers in Canada can charge their Canadian customers this online sales tax, or it's just general sales tax. But if the customer or the retailer was outside Canada, then no taxes would apply. So really, in conclusion there, Chair, taxing online retailers may prove attractive as it would be a good way of raising revenue. However, it must be weighed up. It could be expensive and also could possibly hinder entrepreneurship. So that's really a brief overview, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Michael. Can I just ask, when do you become an online retailer? I mean, obviously, there's a lot of people who go onto eBay and Amazon and sell through those particular spheres. At what level of activity would they qualify for such a tax?
Well, that's a very good question. The way that you would legislate, if you're in terms of legislation, or how you would deal with that, really, at the moment, you would have to look at the VAT thresholds, which is, I think, is revenue of $80,000 per year. Certainly in the US, that the Marketplace Fairness Act looks at any annual revenue which would be over $1 million. So anything under $1 million, they wouldn't fall into the act. So really, they're talking about substantial online retail in terms of policy in the US. So
there's no indication then from the government in Westminster that there'll be any taxation proposals in this regard coming forward? No,
they seem to be quite against it. Double taxation rule reason.
And in terms of the revenues that would be generated, is there any figures available in that regard?
Not for the UK now, but there's a section in the US. I think it's mentioned in terms of the revenue. Yes, on page 14, they would reckon that it could raise up to 23 billion across the US. But of course, that would be the maximum amount across the world. I would imagine that would be the case.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Chair.
Thanks very much, Chair. Thanks for your presentation. Can I ask you, what are the main commercial advantages that online traders have over, as you call them, the bricks and mortar trader?
Well, in terms of rates, they can use various distribution techniques so that they can certainly lower the amount. Say, for example, I've mentioned, I think, a technique called drop shifting. So the online retailer can actually lower the amount of storage that they need completely, because they can contact the wholesaler to send so the wholesaler then sends the good directly to the customer, so they don't actually need any storage space at all. So that could be, so therefore they wouldn't need any commercial property, therefore they wouldn't need any non-domestic rates. And similarly as well, your bricks and mortar retailers can use these techniques as well, but they tend to be most effective in the online transactions. They can use a just-in-time distribution technique where they can basically get it from the wholesaler, get the item, say if it's perfect ball boots, they can get it from the wholesaler and then send it on directly to the customer the minute they get it. So they don't, again, they would very much limit the amount of storage that they would need. Therefore, the amount of non-domestic rates would be minimal in that instance.
Yeah. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, Adrian?
Thank you, Chair. Very interesting presentation, but do we know how many online traders we have here and to what extent are they trading?
That again would, I think you would have to look at the VAT transactions, and that appears to be very difficult to catch. I think one of the criticisms in this area is that anyone basically not registering for VAT won't actually show up. So there's certainly a perception in the bricks and mortar, the high street retailers, that that is a significant loophole.
But surely there are a lot of bricks and mortar retailers now, online traders as well,
Yeah,
because that's subsidising the business, keeping it there.
Absolutely correct.
But I was thinking more of the big supermarkets, Tesco, Asda, how they do online shopping and all that there. You know, they must be taking up a biggest percentage of the market here.
Yeah.
I'm sure there might be somewhere there that we could, maybe into the next presentation, the small business rate relief. Maybe it could be something we could tap into there as well.
Well, I mean, they would be paying VAT, and they would also be paying rates, for non-domestic rates for their warehouses, but that's essentially the problem, because there's no physical property involved in the online transaction, that the rates doesn't seem to fit, because it's a property tax. So you could be an online retailer here. You could do it now. You could do it at home. You could do it outside. You can actually do it online, conduct an online retail transaction anywhere.
I know.
So that seems to be the problem in terms of legislating through rates.
Yeah.
Okay. Ian?
Adrian just asked the question I was going to ask. You asked the question, the first question that I was going to ask as well. So I think it's been answered.
Okay, any other members?
I just asked, Chair, I was interested in the section, on mixed use. This is obviously a thing, but it seems to be predicated upon building control being triggered, to change this thing. But if somebody decides, for example, look, I'll start selling boats from my garden, there's no way that's picked up, is it?
Do you mean in terms of enforcement, really, and how LPS
or a rate change?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, the table on page 8, I think, deals with that quite specifically. I think it's maybe the table before. Yeah, I mean, it seems to be the LPS do rely on, if you like, whistleblowers or building control. There doesn't seem to be a mechanism in place that would routinely check non-domestic properties, but really the problem would be these are domestic properties that we're talking about, so it would be difficult to see how they could routinely enforce that, because it would be administratively quite expensive, I would have thought. But again, that's a question for LPS and
I'm behind you with the answer.
Not Brian, might be here.
Thanks.
No, I mean, it's an interesting point that Leslie makes, because I know a number of people who have stores or garages, and the living quarters is upstairs.
Yeah.
Downstairs could be used obviously for business as well, so it seems a bit of a large loophole.
Yeah, well, the rate seems to, the rule seems to be if they can prove domestic use in that portion of the house, i.e. you can put an iron board up in a garage, then that, or a garage per se has a car in it, then that's domestic use. So the commercial use must be exclusive. Say, for example, a dentist's operating room is in someone's house, so that's clearly a domestic dwelling. But the use of that room is exclusively commercial, so that part of that property would be would be liable to non-domestic rates, and then you would add the two together and that would come up with your rate bill. That seems to be the essential issue, I suppose.
Okay, folks. All right, Michael. Thanks again. Members, can I seek agreement to forward the research paper to the Department for response? And also in terms of the next issue, could we ask what scope exists to design a local sales or transaction tax on online retailing in such a way that would fall within existing devolved powers? Members agreed?
Great.
Moving on to the business rates review terms of reference and small business rates relief beyond 1516. This is pages 31 to 49 of your packs. Morning, Brian.
Morning, Chair.
Very welcome.
I'm sorry I missed the start of Michael's presentation.
You want to respond to any of those points?
Well, from what I can pick up, you've raised the question of how can LPS pick up commercial use of domestic property and rate them? And you're quite right, the current triggers for doing that are building control and whistleblowers. That's their predominant, but it's not confined to that. All public authorities are obliged to inform LPS, and this is in the rates order, the legislation, where there's any change that would give rise to a change in rates. So, you know, for instance, if somebody's selling the boats out the back of the house, presumably they need some sort of planning cover for that, or some sort of public license to do that. Well, that authority should be advising LPS. I mean, I can come back to the committee maybe on that particular point, but there's no deficiency in terms of the policy, because it's a matter of the administrative practice of LPS. As you know, I don't work for LPS, I'm in the policy unit, but as far as the policy is concerned, we're pretty clear. If somebody, and Michael's quite correct, makes exclusive use part of a domestic property for business purposes, that should be rated for business rates. There's no doubt about that.
Is there any information available that you're aware of in regard to those who are bricks and mortar businesses that also engage in online activity, online sales?
Is there, sorry, I missed the first point. Is there...
We had the discussion about bricks and mortar versus online retailers, but there's a bit of a crossover there, I would say, too.
Well, there is. Some business models involve a bit of a mixture between, you know, trading wholly out of the property, and there's the click and collect business that is quite a recent phenomena. Rates are just a property tax. They just rate the rental value of the premises on which the business is conducted. So I don't know whether you couldn't, through the rating system, charge extra for those that work online. I think we can only charge rates proportionate to the rental value of the premises. So if the predominance of online retailers in a particular area leads to an increase in rental values, well, that can be picked up at the next revaluation, but that's a pretty indirect way of doing it. But there's certainly no way of getting at the value of the business, at the value of the online business in relation to ratepayers, which is one of the points that I want to pick up in terms of the review of the business rates system. In a sense, that's where this all started, because the Minister was getting a lot of correspondence, people complaining about there not being a level playing field and so on. And that prompted him to make the commitment, or the previous Minister make the commitment to undertake a fundamental review of business rates, because the bricks and mortar character of rates maybe isn't fit for, you know, the way business is conducted today. And that's kind of what started off this whole issue of maybe it's time we had a proper look again at the whole system of business rates, given the transformation in the way particularly retailing is conducted. But it applies throughout the whole business, throughout all business activity in Northern Ireland. Everybody is doing things in different ways. We're shopping differently, we're living differently, we're spending our leisure time differently, and it does beg the question whether the taxation system is sufficiently responsive to that change.
Go on, David, here.
Yeah, can I just ask you a question? is information from HMRC available to LPS?
No, it's not. Other than transaction details from the taxes office through the stamp duty office. So they will get market information through that, but they certainly will not get trading information or anything about somebody's financial affairs. That channel is not open to LPS, and it's not open to counterparts in the rest of the UK either, nor do I think to the administration in the south in terms of the valuation office in Ireland. In Dublin, they don't have access to taxation records either.
Well, the reason I was asking was that business that are conducted from domestic premises.
Yeah.
Sometimes the overheads are shared between business and domestic, and HMRC would have that information, so they would be aware that business is being conducted from that particular premise. But you're saying that LPS cannot avail of that information?
Yeah, it's my understanding that that's not a channel available to them. I can come back to the committee on that point if you want me to, but my understanding is that they don't do that, and they don't do it anywhere in the British Isles.
Okay. Thanks, Chair.
Okay. Brian, in terms of paragraph 4 of your paper, you stated that the review will be much more wide-ranging and ambitious than the same review of business rates in England. In what way would it be more ambitious?
Because if you look at the terms of reference that were published by Treasury on the 16th of March, it starts off by saying that they Treasury favour a property-based tax, and therefore, by saying that, it effectively rules out consideration of other things. I mean, there's been talk this morning about whether an online sales tax or whatever could be used. So this review wouldn't take that into account, whereas our review in Northern Ireland, I think, could take that into account. So that's one of the fundamentals. They also mention that they don't want to disturb too much the current system of reliefs and exemptions within the business rate system in England. So again, that's another limiting factor.
To a certain extent, you're telling me starting with a blank sheet, or
well, that's what we want to do.
Yeah.
We want to start with a blank sheet and see where that takes us. And that's one of the reasons why we've decided to take this approach using Innovation Labs. Innovation Labs is something I'd never heard the term until about 3 or 4 months ago. But it is something that has been used successfully in other areas. And we thought this was a good way of getting a very early engagement with the business community and to help kind of kick-start the review, not just to inform the terms of reference, but also to inform the drafting of a consultation paper, because in the autumn we're going to have to go out and consult on this issue. And I think it's useful to get business organisations and the voluntary sector and everybody else that is affected by business rates into the room to decide, well, what sort of taxation system do we need for Northern Ireland, and just to have some feedback in terms of what should the guiding principles for this review be, what criteria should we judge various options against, and how should we conduct the review. Now, we're not bound to accept all the recommendations from this lab, but I think it is useful to get business organisations in on square one. And
can I just ask on that point, Brian, in terms of the participants in the lab, DFP and LPS aren't in the participants, would they become on a mega?
We are not in the room except by invitation to give presentations. So they'll want to know from me and from my team how the current business rate system works, and I will be presenting, I think, probably on Monday morning to that, and I'll come back at the invitation of the lab. But we're out of the room, and we think it's very important that we are, and this is the way it has worked. The labs that have taken place already in regulatory impact assessment, I mean, DETI weren't in the room for that, yet they're the lead department, and I think it's very important that we allow people to have a free discussion without undue influence coming to bear from people like me.
And in terms of the participants themselves, how were they selected? And how are you sure that that covers all the bases, that nobody's been missed out?
Well, we couldn't possibly cover all the bases. We've tried to get as many A-list participants as we can, and we do have an established list of business organisations, but it's not just business organisations. We need the voluntary sector represented through NICFA. We need the voice of local government in the room as well. So we certainly don't claim to have covered everybody, but it's not a public this is not the review itself. This is an opportunity to help establish objectives for the review and criteria for the review. It's not actually, when we go out, we'll have a full public consultation and engage with everybody, but you couldn't possibly engage with everybody within the environment of an innovation lab. There wouldn't be a room big enough to house them. But we think we've got most of the main players.
Adrian?
Just on that particular point, Brian, see your written confirmation of Farmers Union.
Yes.
Is there any other rural groups that you could hit there to get the rural business people involved in it as well?
Well, there's the Rural Community Network. We could still ask a Rural Community Network.
I just think it's important to get a rural perspective to it as well.
Yeah, and I agree with that. That's why we were very keen to get the Ulster Farmers Union on board.
Now, what do you say about? Are you still waiting on them, or have they confirmed?
I'm going to get an update this afternoon in terms of who has actually. Most of the people on the list already have confirmed, but the Ulster Farmers Union is one body that hasn't. So I'll find out this afternoon whether they are able to attend. And even if they aren't able to attend for the full 4 days, we would hope they would be able to come along for part of it.
Yeah, they sort of need them.
Yeah.
Rural people need.
Deputy Chair.
Thanks, sir. Just in relation to the online sales tax, one of the major causes of the decline of town centres has been identified as the growing prevalence of online trading, and town centre traders have been encouraged to have an online presence themselves in order to help them survive and compete with the bigger global online companies and so on. And is it not ironic that we're now talking about taxing that activity, which would leave any advantage that town centre traders were getting from an online presence? You know, it would virtually wipe out that advantage.
Yeah, that could be the case. We'd like to explore all of these issues through the review, but you're absolutely right. You know, maybe 5 years ago we were all talking in black and white terms in terms of high street retailers versus online, but most of the certainly high street names have an online presence, and click and collect is a big thing in terms of bringing people back into stores. So it's not as black and white as we might have thought in the past, and I think that's something we'd want to explore as part of the review.
I've met with some business people who previously traded in England, and they're constantly telling me that the level of rates in England is much lower than it is in Northern Ireland. Is that the case?
As a general rule, no, it's not. If you're comparing similar premises with similar premises, there's no point in looking at averages, because the average in England is thrown by the likes of the City of London, Heathrow, some of the big petrochemical plants and so on that are all rateable. So the average doesn't tell the story. But my understanding from looking at similar premises, you know, say comparing a shop in Hull with a shop in Belfast in a similar kind of area, that the rate liability should be more or less the same. The one exception to that is that the English system has a more generous small business rate relief scheme at the moment. So there's some very low value properties actually are paying no rates at the moment under their scheme. They've had a temporary enhancement of small business rate relief over there. So at the very bottom end, I think there will be cases where people are paying more in Northern Ireland than they're paying in England, but as a general rule, they don't.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Just on that point as well, in terms of overheads for small businesses, I mean, obviously there's been the non-domestic revaluation. I'm sure all members have received some complaints about revals, etc. How many small businesses, many businesses in general, have challenged their NAV? Since the reval?
1,000, between 1,200 and 1,300, which is about 2% of the. I'm taking out exemptions, properties that are exempt where people would never challenge them. So on the net figure, I would say about 2% it's running at. Now they're coming in steadily, but they're not. They haven't come in as an avalanche. Mm-hmm. So at the moment, we're not complacent about this, and it still concerns me, you know, that a high number of ratepayers high number of ratepayers would challenge, because that shows dissatisfaction. But at the moment, it's looking okay. It's certainly looking manageable from LPS's point of view.
But are there many hotspots? Because there seems to be one or two towns that are saying that, you know, they've been detrimentally affected as a whole, as opposed to some other towns where there's been more of a mixed bag.
There are, yes, and there are also sectors that are particular sectors that are have faced substantial increases. You know about there was very compelling evidence given to this committee by the garage convenience stores. Wind farms, another example, where as a sector, some of their values have gone up 4 to 6 times as a result of the revaluation. There's the licensed trade in the Cathedral Quarter has gone up substantially from a very low base, admittedly, but they are facing significant increases. So it's not just some towns, it's also sectors within towns or sectors throughout Northern Ireland. And that's what happens with revaluations. Those sectors and locations that have fared better in the last 10 years than others will pay more, and those that have fared less well or less successfully will pay less. That's the way revaluation works. The problem has been the amount of time between revaluations. But it's in, you know, revaluation is also, whilst it has had an adverse effect on some ratepayers, and I'm not trying to talk that down in any way, but it's also had a good effect. If you saw the article in the Irish News, I think it was yesterday, the day before, where many estate agents are saying that Donegal Place is actually being revitalised as a consequence of the revaluation, because previously the rates were based on 2001 levels when Donegal Place was thriving. But as the years went on and Victoria Square came along, that changed the whole focus of retail in Belfast. But with the rates still being high, it made it even more difficult to attract tenants into Donegal Place. So that has been one of the good effects of the revaluation. It has helped investment in the likes of Donegal Place.
Deputy Chair.
Thanks. Yeah, that's the point I was going to raise with you, the interval between revaluations. I mean, obviously, if you was it 2001 levels, the rates were previously based on. So obviously, if you know, if you have a revaluation 13 or 14 years later, you know, some people are going to get quite a shock. Are you giving any thought to a sort of more regular review, which would avoid that sort of huge hike that people, especially we mentioned the forecourts, garages and so on, some licensed premises that they have seen in this revaluation?
Yeah. Well, of course, the question assumes that when we get through this business rates review, we've still got the existing system, but assume, for the sake of your question, we have still got the same business rates system. The minister's already, the previous minister, I keep forgetting, the previous ministers gave a commitment to more regular revaluations in the future. So, and that's certainly something as policy officials we would favour for exactly the reasons you've given. Because if you leave it too long, it actually it becomes quite a shock to some businesses.
And can I ask you, what are the figures for the number of businesses that have been brought into the small business rates relief scheme through the revaluation, and what are the figures for those which are now out of it because of increases?
I can answer the second question, which is about 800 ratepayers have dropped out of small business rate relief. The numbers coming in, the reason I don't know this is because LPS has to apply rules in terms of are the businesses multiples, are they entitled to other forms of relief, and I simply haven't seen those figures yet, but I can get that for the committee, no problem. But the figures for those dropping out of small business rate relief as a consequence of the revaluation, it's around 800.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. The other members, Leslie?
Just one point, Chair. I know that other business taxes, apply, but I'm always concerned that the actual rating, the rental value thing as applies to business, doesn't really take into account the success of that business. For example, you could have a very small outlet doing very, very big business, and that does seem inequitable.
Yeah.
Is there anything can be done about that?
Well, hopefully the review will look at it. If you're asking me today what I think, it's a very difficult nut to crack. I mean, there's one word to answer that, and that's Starbucks. You try to tax Starbucks, multi-million-pound business that can move profit around or hide profit, or well, it's just hiding profit, but they can
redeploy.
Other businesses may well do that, but they can certainly move profit around and avoid taxation in particular countries. So that's a problem, and I'm not sure anybody's been able to solve it. But that's a point that we need to look at in the review. Is there some sort of other indicator that would help the kind of ability to pay equation? I struggle with that, to be honest with you, but we have a completely open mind if something comes out of this review that helps us with that. But every business is different, so trying to compare, trying to adopt some sort of turnover trigger point or profit trigger point is very difficult, because every business operates on different lines. Even businesses within the same sector would operate on different profit levels and different turnover levels and so on. So it's very, very hard to get some sort of additional measure in there to as I say, to help the ability to pay issue.
Just to come back to the innovation lab, Brian, after it's concluded, what's the next steps or milestones?
Well, the next step is that we'll look at the findings and the results of the innovation lab and what the innovation lab has told us. We'll report to the minister. We'll draft up some terms of reference for the minister to consider and a way forward, because the innovation lab is not just advising us on principles, objectives and criteria. We also want them to advise us on how we should undertake the review. So I'll report back to the minister, and once the minister has cleared that, I'll come to the committee. Hopefully before the summer recess. I mean, that's our plan. We've got this lab organised between the 1st of June and the 4th of June. That should give us plenty of time to get that through the minister and to the committee. And we'd like to be able to sign off terms of reference. Terms of reference will have to go to the executive in due course.
Okay, members?
Okay.
Brian, thanks again.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, members, moving on to the next research briefing. I can refer members to pages 51 to 76 of your packs, a comparative perspective on public procurement requirements, social, environmental and economic, and a DFP response. The research has been tabled separately. Morning, Colin.
Good morning, Chairman. The last time I was in this committee, I was observing that I was presenting a paper on the Barnett formula, which is one that is an issue that recurs and recurs and recurs. And then I realised when I was looking back at various papers I've written on this public procurement issue, that the social clauses is in that same category of something that when I first started in the Assembly 6 and a bit years ago, this committee, or the predecessor of this committee, had I think begun its inquiry into public procurement, which is where really a lot of the impetus for the policy impetus for incorporating social clauses into procurement came from, and it was accepted by the minister and put in then to the next programme for government. So this isn't something which has just sprung out of nowhere, but it's something that clearly from the way there are different approaches across the UK jurisdictions and also in Ireland, nobody's quite cracked the exact maybe the best way of doing this yet. I mean, I think everyone shares. There seems to be a common enthusiasm for using government purchasing power to enhance your outcomes, but getting the exact way of doing that is maybe hasn't quite been cracked yet. Now this iteration of my research on the issue was really, I think, requested by this committee in relation. It was spurred by the fact that SIB have been commissioned by the executive to review, take a look at the way social clauses operate in Northern Ireland and see if they can find some ways to improve that. Now, in the previous papers I've written have found that the policy in the legislative environment around public procurement changes, and it changes quite regularly, and it's always evolving. So it's difficult. I mean, even looking back on the paper around this time last year, things have moved on since then, and we've got a new European directive. So that kind of background is shifting all the time. Having said that, some of the stuff is very much it hasn't changed. In the paper I wrote last year, one of the big issues came up against was that the data wasn't comparable between. It was across time. It wasn't comparable. Now, what happened recently when CPD had came to this committee, and they hadn't had a return from one of the departments, so it's not just that data's not comparable. In some cases, it's just absent. So that's. I would be quite honest with you. I didn't even go down the route of asking for data this time because, there's a certain, well, what's the point in making the same point again? This is something that I think probably needs to be fixed. And having spoken with the SIB officials who are involved in the review, it's certainly something that they've been coming up against as well. This data issue. So that may be one thing that needs to be cracked. In essence, the paper finds pretty much the same things as we found before. Public procurement is heavily defined by the European Union, but the European Union has brought in recent changes. We've got new regulations covering Northern Ireland and England and Wales, and there will be new ones in Scotland. There is a widespread policy commitment to using some form of social benefit, community social benefit, sustainable development clauses, and in the Republic of Ireland, there's also they maybe come to the table a bit later than other places within the UK, whereas they are now piloting various projects to see how that works out. In essence, there are four, I suppose, key themes really that to me seem particularly important around this issue, and I have raised them under the heading of terminology. So the fact that, and I've referred to this, that in Scotland you're talking about community benefits, in the programme for government we're talking about social clauses, but we're also talking, CPD also talks about sustainable development, and it talks about community benefits, it talks about best, what's the other term it uses? Most advantageous combination of cost, quality and sustainability. So you've got various terms, and it seems to me that until if everyone is to understand clearly what is being sought by the policy, you need a common kind of language in which to discuss that, because if a social clause means one thing to one person and another thing to another person, then understanding how they are operating is rather difficult. And I think you have a tabled paper here, which is the department's response to my paper. Now, it's a bit unusual, this, but I'll mention it because it's come in before I've actually presented it. But one of the things that the CPD have said in their response is that that they have a whole range of community benefits, and then they've provided a list then in the annex to that response. Now, I picked up on this in a previous evidence session with CPD officials as well, is that they'd mentioned, for example, requiring best practice in health and safety, or another example is compliance with a range of EU energy directives. Now, to me, compliance with an EU energy directive is a requirement of a contract. It has to comply with the EU law as transposed in the UK. So to say that that is a social clause, well, it may have social benefits, but what it's not doing is giving you anything extra over and above compliance with the existing law. And I think that's really what the policy objective of the executive is to try and leverage in more benefits rather than just comply with the existing requirements. So that's one point in relation to definition. The second point is then there's another example under social, which is encouraging corporate social responsibility as a social clause. Well, I could encourage you to be corporately socially responsible, but what does it actually mean? I can ask you to do something, but if I can't compel you in some way, or then where is there a measurable benefit from that clause? Is it actually going to deliver anything? I don't know. So another example perhaps there in the list is requiring equality in the workplace. We already have lots of equality legislation, which I think applies irrespective of whether or not you're delivering a contract for a public body. So you have to protect people from harassment, for example, and provide a safe and harmonious working environment. So whether you're working for a private entity or for the government shouldn't make any difference in terms of how you go about that. So that's the kind of terminology issue. Then the next theme, I suppose, is that the different jurisdictions have taken different approaches. There's very much a policy and administrative approach taken in Northern Ireland. We've got a lot of policy commitment. There's lots of guidance. There's no statutory requirement. Now in Scotland, they're bringing in a statutory requirement to consider the use of community benefit clauses. There's a private member's bill in the Oireachtas, which is requiring, the inclusion of various social clauses. And in England, there is a statutory. There's the Social Value Act. So you have a legislative sort of approach, whereas we have in Northern Ireland a policy approach. Now the question is maybe whether one approach is better than the other, or having tried a policy approach and you're not satisfied with it, then maybe you do need statute, maybe you don't. The trouble is, without data, going back to that, it's very hard to know whether your approach is really working unless you can measure it properly. I think, actually, now DFP did refer, in its response, to the point that I'd raised about whether you needed some sort of statutory footing. And they've said it's worth reflecting that the policy-based approach to public procurement policy and best practice is the accepted norm. Now, I'm not sure quite sure who's accepted that norm or what the evidence for that is, but it certainly seems to me that that the fact that lots of other jurisdictions are going ahead with legislation suggests that perhaps they're rejecting this policy approach, but that may not necessarily be a good reason for Northern Ireland to follow suit and say yes, we do need it. But I think that's a case that and CPD have said, well, the SIB review should turn this up, and I would be fairly confident that they will turn up, a good kind of answer to that question, whether it is really needed, a sort of statutory basis, if you like. In relation then, a sort of third theme in relation to the issue of statute is the powers of contracting authorities to actually include these contracts, these clauses rather. Now, we know from previous evidence that Northern Ireland has quite a litigious public procurement environment. That can be the same everywhere, I guess, but I certainly remember witnesses to the public procurement inquiry that this committee held saying that Northern Ireland at that time was a sort of world leader in public procurement litigation, which is not something you really want to be proud of, I don't think. But so the fact that suggests a certain or encourages a certain caution in professionals, and unless you have a clear, I suppose, definition of what you're trying to achieve, a clear framework for doing it, and then a clear sort of set of powers in order to engage in these contracts, then there's, I suppose, there's risk then of being challenged. Now, I think from what I understand of the new European directive, that issue has been clarified quite significantly, whereas before, under the old European procurement regime, it was a case of what could you do in terms of social benefits that would comply with the existing law, whereas the new directive actually makes it explicitly possible to do or to include these benefits in various parts of the procurement process. So that's I guess a positive development. And then my fourth theme there is data, but I've already talked about that in relation to terminology, so I'll move on. So I've said that we've got an issue around different definitions. We've got an issue around statutory duties in certain cases, potentially in the Republic of Ireland, but certainly in England and Scotland. We've got a big emphasis, but until we crack the data issue, we won't know how effective the policy emphasis is until you know exactly how well these are being applied. And when you've got a broad definition of what's a social clause, it's very easy for a contracting authority to say, yes, oh yeah, we've got lots of social clauses, we're complying with that requirement. The other issue then is what I called an accountability gap in relation to DFP's own power to get information from the other departments or contracting authorities. Now, the Finance Committee has come up against this in other issues, I think, where DFP come to the committee and they say, well, we can't force departments to do one thing or another, and that's something that I think the SIB officials, when I met with them, had mentioned that they had recognised as something that might need to be addressed in some way. And I think in DFP's response to the paper, they have recognised that CPD is obliged to monitor the commitment, which it's trying to do, but in terms of enforcing the reporting, it's outside the CPD officials' control. I suppose they're I'm trying to think of the right phrase. Hungarian would say that they're a baker's sega allot, which is under the frog's rear end. It's kind of, in English, it's like between a rock and a hard place. They're sort of caught in a position of not being able to enforce the rules that they have to report on, if you like. So that's rather difficult. So that may be something the committee can think about how that issue might be addressed. I think that's all. I'll take any questions. Sorry, I've gone on a bit there. But if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you, Colin. No, it's an excellent paper. I suppose it highlights the fact that when it comes to social clauses, you know, social clauses are whatever they want them to be. It's part of the problem too, you know, it's sort of it's a wide definition. But I think there is an issue in terms of what you've flagged up in terms of data, that perhaps some departments need to take it more seriously. But as another case too, that, you know, in terms of the department, there is an opportunity, given that they approve business cases for all department procurement, that will give them some leverage to try and ensure that social value could be considered at an early stage.
I'm not sure exactly. No, this is something. DFP has a role in approving certain expenditure. You know, there are various thresholds. But I think CPD is only involved in certain. No, what is it? Certain strategic. I would have to check. But the COPEs, the Centres of Procurement Expertise, also have a role there. So I'm not sure necessarily that DFP does have a role in approving all expenditure. It will approve a percentage of it, you know, and I think it's the high value things, and DFP supply division will do a test on a certain proportion. They do a kind of, I don't know, they do a percentage sample, I think, of business cases to check the sort of way that they're being complied with, but they certainly don't look at all of them. But it could be that they do be involved in all the big kind of strategic ones.
And in terms of the private members bill in the south, is the government going to back that?
Based on what the Minister said, I think on page 19 there's a bit of an extract from a written answer which suggests that, well, it said that the government didn't oppose the bill. That's not the same as backing the bill, but so they haven't opposed it. So they said, whilst the government sees merit in using social clauses in circumstances, it's important contracting authorities are not compelled to use them on every contract. So I think they're perhaps happy with the general thrust of the bill, but think that the legislation needs to work on it. That's part of the legislative process. That's not unusual, I don't think. It
reflects the fact you're saying that governments are recognising there's a need for legislation as opposed to just guidelines.
Well, I think it's hard to say exactly what it's probably too soon to say what the government in Dublin thinks, because they have got an ongoing programme, a pilot. So I guess they probably haven't got a firm position yet, because there's not much point running a pilot, and you know, presumably they'll analyse how that works, and then see, you know, to what extent they can support that process, you know, with statute if necessary, presumably.
Okay, members, any further questions? Martin?
Thanks, Colin, and want to welcome Mr. Wales as well to our stimulating discussions. No doubt he will add to those today and future meetings. I don't want you to give up on us. I know you keep on doing these research reports, and we make slow progress, but just to go through that again.
I don't hold you responsible for that.
Well, I'm only here. Well, Mr. Wells certainly is responsible. He's only here one day. I'm only here a few months. Just to bring us through that, so Scotland's about to introduce community, or has introduced community benefit legislation, or
they've got, Scotland has the act in place, but it hasn't been commenced yet.
Okay.
So it's there on the statute, but
close.
They are. I think what they're doing, from memory, is that first of all, what they've got to do is implement the European directive.
Okay.
And once they've done that, then they will work. So they've got a kind of interim position at the moment.
But we will, within a year, you think, have community benefit legislation in Scotland?
I wouldn't like to say within a year.
Okay.
Because it's not within my gift. But as I say, it's there on the statute.
I suppose, and you mentioned a Social Value Act in England.
Yeah, that's been around for a while now and has been reviewed.
You mentioned our friends in Wales in the report.
Yeah.
And their emphasis on well-being and social value as well. I suppose that we all want to get the maximum value from public expenditure, and that's really what the advice on social clauses has been here, and the policy on social clauses. The big flaw in social clauses for me, Chair, is that we still don't have the number of people who received employment as a result of social clauses. We don't know if it's 1 or 1,000. We do know our presentations here by departments and by the private sector that it's been embraced. We have the SIB toolbox. I think there's a willingness within industry to make it work, but we don't have any figures, and that may be linked to the fact that it's not a statutory obligation. Maybe if it was a statutory obligation, they would have to have the figures of the numbers employed. I would certainly like to see us, any way we can increase the value from public procurement to bring other community benefits would be, I think, worthy and praiseworthy, and if we can find a way to make that happen through legislation that the committee or the minister or the executive would bring forward, I think that would be worthwhile. We're certainly not at that stage yet. This latest research, I suppose, just brings us up to date with what may be possible in the time ahead.
Well, I think really, yeah. I mean, part of the reason for doing it is just to say, well, let's have an overview of what's happening, because it provides quite an important backdrop, I think, to the SIB's review. Because when the Strategic Investment Board bring their findings to the committee, I think it's quite helpful to have a sort of for you to have a kind of benchmark and say, well, okay, yeah, this is what's.
So at present, when we do award a contract, we can take other factors into account other than just the lowest price.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yes, because the CPD's procurement note, because ultimately the programme for government requires all contracting authorities, or all departments at least, to do so.
Would that include?
But the issue is not that they have to have a social clause, because they do have to have a social clause, but the fact that a social clause can mean complying with health and safety requirements or complying with the EU Energy Directive. So possibly it's too broad. Maybe that's the issue, and it should be because. Sorry, I'm jumping from one thing to another, but I've just remembered that the Welsh Government have given a focus on a particular. They have said that their sort of top priority is the workforce related, whether it's skills or retention or training of employees. So that's where the top focus should be. So maybe.
But in terms of employment and the type of employers, when we're awarding contracts. Do we have the flexibility at present, for example, if a company we thought wasn't fit, wasn't a company which could deliver a project in the way we'd like to see it? For example, if a company was fined for not paying the minimum wage, do we have the flexibility to say we don't think that's...
Yeah, I think, from memory, the new European legislation refers to that it gives you... sorry, where's it gone? It's here somewhere. It's actually not noted there, but I'm sure I did read something. I'm just trying to find where it is that there was now an ability to exclude companies which had, or contractors which had not complied with certain requirements in the past.
So that was in your research document, maybe, no?
I'm sorry, I can't find it now, but I'm sure maybe it's in there.
But in principle and in policy, yes, if at the minute if you were fined for not paying minimum wage, and we had some of those companies named and shamed earlier in the year, it would of course be a much bigger, I suppose, red flag for companies who want to engage with that if they thought it could affect their ability to win public contracts.
Do it in future. Yeah, it would lend weight to the need to comply with those requirements.
We have that with an existing policy, you think?
Yeah.
You can come back to it?
I will.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Paul?
Thank you. Colin, thank you very much for your paper. It's quite informative, but I do find that social clauses, it's one interpretation whether it is a social clause or not. Somebody could say, well, look, I'm providing apprenticeships to individuals, and part of this contract will be a continuation of their apprenticeship. So there's a social benefit to that, possibly, in some way. I don't necessarily follow down the line, because sometimes firms have to learn by their mistakes. So to exclude them off a list because they've made a faux pas in the past shouldn't be a lifetime ban from operation, public procurement operations. I can see this being an opportunity to, and I'm just wondering how within the paper does it demonstrate European procurement guidelines or rules potentially mean it's open for firms from within the whole area, not just Northern Ireland, but to actually tender. By including a social clause, do we preclude those from outside Northern Ireland in tendering for projects here because they have no social involvement within the community? But that could also have a two-way street, because firms from here are winning contracts in Scotland, England, and in fact we have a firm from our own area working in Germany. So how does that
I think it has to be done in such a way so that it doesn't exclude, because the whole point of the procurement legislation is to ensure that there is a level playing field. So you can't construct a clause in such a way as it excludes firms from outside, because they. But at the same time, you don't necessarily have to be from an area to be able to deliver the social benefit. Because, you know, a German firm could equally well partner with a local organisation which would deliver apprenticeships for the long-term unemployed, say, that you know, than a local firm could do. So that it shouldn't, I don't think, cause that.
I think even looking at it, we had a fairly big private contractor who came into our area to do private work. But the social benefits to what he was doing actually sustained shops, cafes within that area for a number of years while development was going on. And some of those businesses said that was their lifeline. Really, it was the guys coming in at lunchtime and buying their lunch and, you know, bits and pieces, buying boots and all that, kept the local economy going for a number of years. So there's not just on that aspect. How do we? And maybe you're not putting this across right, but I think there is such a woolly aspect as to what a social clause is. We cannot determine really what the benefits are. You know, we can't say, well, look, the fact is that you need security on this site, so we've got a wee firm of security men who actually look after it. But, you know, you have to make sure that these guys are kept happy, because otherwise you could end up with a bit of problem on your site. And by a reverse way, we end up with the protection rackets in a back through the back door, if you understand what I'm saying. We encountered a little bit of that on a major contract which was awarded for the A8 within our area, dual carriageway, where until certain people were brought in to do work on it, the contractor was inundated with fuel thefts, all sorts of problems right through the whole thing. You know, everything that was on site was getting cleaned out every weekend. So their social aspect of it was to bring in a local security firm, I'll use that term very loosely, to ensure that didn't happen. And needless to say, it stopped. But
I don't know if that's the best, fantastic example,
but I'm giving one of how it has worked. But I'm wondering, is that a social clause?
I'm not sure I can. I don't know anything about it, to be honest. I mean, I suppose ultimately you to comply. A government contracting authority is to comply with the law, and so if there's, I think what you're suggesting is there's certain criminality involved. Well, you can't.
Oh, I'm not.
Well, no. If there was sort of fuel thefts or something hampering the contractor, That's not really a matter for procurement legislation to deal with. You have, you know, it's
The appointment of the contractor's already taken place at that stage, if you understand where I'm coming from.
yeah.
But I do think, you know, they could have actually probably circumvented that by possibly intervening at an earlier stage prior to getting the contract to say that they would take on board a local security firm to do their security.
I wouldn't like to comment further.
Maybe it's stuff they all
You did well there.
I think what Paul's trying to say is, how do you actually measure the social cost to the whole community? What it benefits the whole community? You know, how can you ever measure that?
Well, that's it. Until you've got a very tighter definition of what a social clause is, I don't think you can. I mean, one of the points that Paul was raising there was about the sort of multiplier effects, the benefits to the local businesses, the sandwich shops or whatever, the cafes, from having this kind of transient workforce coming in. Now, you can measure that. You can measure that in terms of the increase in turnover in those kind of businesses, but that's really an economic benefit more than a social benefit, and it's fairly, you know, I mean, it's accepted that there is you do get a sort of multiplier effect to the economy from infrastructure spend. So, you know, that is already captured and would be captured in business cases and so on.
Can I just I help Mr. Girvan as well, because he did try to explain what he was saying, but I think this is what he's saying, or it may not be just this interpretation, but let's say we were awarding a contract, and all things being equal, one of the people applying for that contract was a multinational company which has 0-hour contracts, which has a reputation for being headquartered in Luxembourg and not paying its fair share of taxation. And against that, we had a company which scores the same, but it's a social enterprise which is based in the heart of the area, which is employing people, local families for many, many years, occupying perhaps a local community centre or local buildings. In those circumstances, what I'm trying to find out, Colin, do we have the right under existing policy to say, well, actually we prefer the social enterprise because of those judgments about what makes, what builds community, what would bring community benefits, rather than a company coming in and there's I saw a report this day, reported in The Guardian about the International Labour Organization saying that, you know, more and more big companies are not handing out permanent contracts, it's adding to poverty and so on. So my question is, I don't want you looking at any more notes now, Colin, you have to know this, but the right question is, are we allowed...
Expect me to retain this information, Martin?
Are we allowed, all things being equal, to favour, which I think would be, you know, the community enterprise or the community company which is bidding? Would that be illegal, or are we allowed to do that?
Well, if you can demonstrate that they have to comply with best value for money, but the interpretation of best value of money is the most advantageous combination of cost, quality and sustainability to meet the customer requirements. So if you are saying that sustainability is one of the issues around community benefit. Now, you can argue the sustainability of communities is a sustainability issue, it's not just a sort of environmental sustainability, then perhaps there is a way that you can say that you know, fairly, that a social enterprise is supporting sustainability of the community over and above an exterior or an external contractor coming in.
So that an equally excellent service, of course.
Yeah, as long as you're getting, ultimately what you're trying to do is get the best service for the taxpayers' money. That has to be your top priority. You know, you're getting the best hospital built, or you're getting the best cleaning contract that you can get
with community benefits.
With community benefits delivered, as well as the quality of the build or whatever. Yeah.
The answer is yes.
Yeah, it is. Or no.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, members. Okay, Colin, thank you very much again.
Okay.
Thanks, Colin.
Okay, members can advise you that the Strategic Investment Board is due to brief the committee in the autumn on its review of progress in the use of social clauses, and can I seek agreement to forward the research paper to the DFP for a written response to the issues in the meantime. Can I advise members that the next item will be a closed session in line with the usual protocol and considering draft reports.
Okay, Chair. There's 4 items of correspondence at page 79. There's a draft response to the ad hoc committee on the Northern Ireland Public Service Ombudsperson's Bill. This committee had some involvement at a very early stage in terms of public procurement provisions that are contained within the bill, and the committee took evidence from Dr. Tom Frawley and had identified maybe a gap in the powers in relation to public procurement issues, whereby some of the powers allowed fuller investigation in relation to other public bodies, other departments. So at that stage, the committee raised the issue with the OFMDFM committee, and some provisions were included in the bill. Subsequently, it seems, although this committee hasn't been involved in that, the DFP may have expressed some concerns around aspects of that. So the draft response just acknowledges that, but the issue is really with the ad hoc committee at this stage in terms of the committee stage. It's just if members are content with that, that could issue to the ad hoc committee.
Members, great.
And then at page 82 of the pack, the Assembly Secretariat's EU Affairs Manager is just drawing attention to a consultation on Directive on Public Procurement, which relates to the issue of the award of public contracts, and in terms of the decisions taken by contracting bodies can be reviewed effectively and as quickly as possible, and that actions to review can be taken before or after signing of a contract. This is an area which the committee has received some briefing from DFP and identified as a priority in terms of EU type work that it would want to monitor, because the department had identified the need for mediation provision to be taken into account in these circumstances. I think the committee heard earlier about the high level of litigation around public procurement, so it's really, I think there's a concern to minimise and to reduce that as much as possible. So it's really just to draw this to the committee's attention, and perhaps seek an update from the department in terms of any input that it's having in relation to that consultation. Chair.
Okay.
Then the Carnegie Trust has a conference invitation. That's at page 85 to 86 of the pack. It's in relation to measuring well-being. That's an open invite to all committee members. So just again, it clashes with the committee meeting. That's just a point to note in terms of the morning aspect of it. And then finally, Chair, we included a press clipping in correspondence in relation to executive moves to purchase five Belfast office buildings. Just included this because in a previous briefing the committee got on the property management programme, I think members had raised an issue about what's the rationale behind the move from, or the policy that seemed to have existed before, of government being a tenant rather than a landlord. And it's really just to check if the committee wanted to, seek advice or an explanation of the rationale in terms of the longer term value for money around that. It's just for information purposes.
Reid. And all the correspondence. Okay, members, draft work programme pages 89 to 92. In terms of the Edinburgh visit, then, due to membership changes and cancellations, up to 3 spaces are now available for the committee visit to Edinburgh. This takes place on Wednesday 27th to Thursday 28th of May, and the purpose of which is to meet with Scottish Government officials and the Scottish Parliament's Finance Committee to discuss issues of mutual interest, including the operation of the Barnett formula. The draft itinerary for the visit is pages 6 to 9 of your table papers.
So, Chair, a list of the potential discussion topics on page 9 at the end there. See quite a range of areas of potential mutual interest between the committee and the Finance Committee and the Scottish Parliament, and also the Scottish Executive side as well.
and then we'll be in the Parliament for First Minister questions on Thursday. Okay, so if members wish to express any interest for that through the Secretariat by close of play today, and then the confirmed members will get a visit pack. They'll be issued via email before Tuesday the 26th. Okay, members content the work programme is updated to reflect agreements made today.
Agreed.
Any other business?
No.
Yes, the European Commission Vice President visit. Can I inform members understood the Finance Minister recently met with EC Vice President Katainen to discuss investment plans and how the £315 billion Juncker investment plan could complement the NI Investment Fund. Can I just take members' views and whether they wish to request the Department to provide a written report on the outcome from this meeting?
Agreed.
Agreed. Okay, next meeting will be Wednesday 3rd of June at 10 a.m. in room 30.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30.